There are moments in life that act as a hinge, swinging a door shut on everything you thought you knew, leaving you standing in a new, unfamiliar room. You don't always hear the click of the latch, not right away. Sometimes, all you hear is the clinking of ice in a crystal glass and the murmur of a city that has no idea your world is about to end. My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed, and for most of my 58 years, I believed that love was an investment with a guaranteed return. Not in dollars, of course, but in something far more valuable. Belonging. I was wrong. The evening my education truly began, I was sitting at a restaurant called The Summit. The name was fitting. Perched 60 floors above Manhattan, it felt like sitting on a shelf in the sky. The city below wasn't a map of streets, but a galaxy of someone else's dreams, glittering and indifferent. I felt like a ghost at the banquet, haunting the edges of a life that was no longer mine. My dress, a simple navy chiffon I'd owned for years, was clean and elegant, but in a room of bespoke suits and glittering designer labels, it felt like a whisper in a shouting match. Across the starched white linen sat my son, Mason, and his fiancée, Olivia. They were not whispering. They were radiant, luminous, a perfectly curated image of modern success. Mason, my Mason, wore a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my first car. He had his father's eyes, but a smile that was entirely his own, or perhaps it now belonged to Olivia. She sat beside him, a vision in silk, her hand resting on his arm, not with affection, but with a sense of ownership, like a collector displaying a prized acquisition. They had called it a celebration. "Big news, Mom," Mason had said over the phone, his voice buzzing with an energy I hadn't heard since he was a boy describing a home run. "Olivia and I want to take you out. The summit, you deserve it." And I, like any mother, believed him. The appetizers arrived on plates that looked more like works of art. A single scallop here, a swirl of saffron foam there. We made small talk, the weather, the traffic, the abstract painting on the far wall, but their eyes kept meeting over the candlelight, sharing a silent language I was no longer privy to. A cold space was growing around our table, a quiet, invisible frost that no amount of pleasantry could thaw. Then, Mason cleared his throat, lifted his champagne flute, and the performance began. "Mom," he said, his smile stretching wide. "As you know, I've poured my life into Aura Health for the past 5 years." I smiled back, a genuine, watery smile. I hadn't just known it, I had funded it. I had been the foundation upon which he had built his empire. "Well," he continued, pausing for dramatic effect. "This morning we received an official offer. Aura Health is being acquired by Gen Pharma for $200 million. The number hung in the air, shimmering like the chandeliers above us. 200 million. For a moment, the breath left my body. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and immediate. It wasn't about the money. It was about the validation. It meant that every sacrifice had been worth it. My mind reeled back through the years, a slideshow of impossible choices. I saw myself standing in the empty living room of my parents' house, the scent of my mother's lavender sachet still clinging to the air, just before I handed the keys to a realtor. I felt the slick, cold paper of the withdrawal slip as I emptied my retirement account, the sum of a lifetime of careful saving, distilled into a wire transfer. Nearly $1 million. My entire future, handed over on a promise, on a son's dream, on a mother's love. It was a deal sealed not with contracts, but with hugs and assurances whispered over late-night coffee as we hunched over his business plans at my kitchen table. "Oh, Mason," I breathed, my voice thick with emotion. That's wonderful. I knew you could do it." He beamed. "We did it, Mom." For a fleeting second, that single word, we wrapped around my heart like a warm blanket, but just as quickly it was gone. Olivia placed her hand on Mason's, her diamond ring catching the light. She turned to me, her expression a careful mask of sympathy. "Evelyn," she began, her voice soft and smooth. "With this big change, Mason and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future. About finances." The shift in tone was so abrupt it was like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. "Your apartment in the city," she continued. "It's lovely, but it is rather costly to maintain." I stared at her confused. My apartment, the one I'd been able to afford precisely because my other assets were gone. Mason jumped in, his voice losing its celebratory warmth and taking on a new, disturbingly practical edge. What Olivia is saying, Mom, is that we need to be smart now. We need to trim any unnecessary expenses to ensure the deal closes smoothly and to set ourselves up for the future. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking at a point just over my shoulder, as if addressing a subordinate. "We've found a wonderful place for you," he said. "A senior living community just outside the city, in New Jersey. It's safe, quiet, and more importantly, much more cost-effective." The words were not stones, but scalpels, cutting away at something deep inside me. Cost-effective. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands, resting in my lap, suddenly felt ice cold. "Unnecessary expenses?" I whispered, the sound swallowed by the restaurant's cheerful din. "But what about my share in the company? Mason, I was your first investor." And then he laughed. It was not a laugh of joy, but of dismissal. A short, sharp sound that severed the last thread of hope in my chest. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were those of a stranger. "Mom, please," he said, the condescension dripping from every word. "That was a gift. You gave me that money to help me get started. There were no papers, no contracts. You don't understand how business works." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if letting me in on a secret. "Just think of this as us taking care of you now. It's what's best." Olivia nodded, adding with a pathetic tilt of her head, "We know what's best for you, Evelyn." They spoke of me as if I weren't there, as if I were a line item on a budget, a liability to be managed, a problem to be solved with a brochure for a cut-rate retirement home in another state. The celebration was a sham. This was an eviction notice, served between the scallop and the main course. I sat there, 60 floors in the air, surrounded by wealth and beauty, and felt my heart shatter into a million pieces. I had sacrificed my past and my future for my son's dream, only to be told that in the final accounting, I was nothing more than an unnecessary expense. I don't remember the walk out of the restaurant. I must have nodded, perhaps even smiled, a mechanical gesture learned over decades of putting the comfort of others before my own. The descent in the glass elevator was a silent, glittering fall from grace. On the street, a yellow cab materialized out of the river of headlights, and Mason, ever the gentleman in public, opened the door for me. "I'll call you tomorrow, Mom," he said, his voice a perfect imitation of a caring son. He didn't meet my eyes. The door clicked shut, encasing me in vinyl and the faint scent of pine air freshener. The driver asked for the address, and the words came out of my mouth, a ghost of a whisper. As the cab pulled into the relentless flow of New York traffic, I watched them through the rear window, Mason and Olivia standing on the curb, bathed in the warm glow of the restaurant's entrance. They weren't looking at the cab. They were looking at each other, and they were smiling. Then, Mason leaned in and kissed her, a triumphant, proprietary kiss. The scene dissolved into the blur of city lights. The lights had always been magical to me. Cold, distant fires that promised a million possibilities. Tonight they just looked cold and distant. The taxi's meter ticked over with an audible click, a rhythmic, digital reminder that every moment, every block had a price. Cost-effective. The word echoed in the hollow space that had opened up inside my chest. When I finally stood before my own apartment door, my hands fumbled with the keys as if they belonged to a stranger. The lock turned with a loud, definitive snap that seemed to mock the quiet elegance of the hallway. Inside, the silence was a physical presence. It had a weight to it, pressing in on me from the high ceilings and the dark, gleaming hardwood floors. This was the apartment Olivia had called costly. This was the expense that needed to be trimmed. I walked through the living room, my fingers trailing over the back of the velvet sofa. I didn't turn on the lights. The ambient glow from the city outside was enough to illuminate the ghosts. Over there, by the window, was where Mason had stood just last Christmas, telling me how much this place felt like home. On the mantelpiece, a row of silver frames chronicled his life, a gapped-toothed smile in a Little League uniform, a serious, proud face under a graduation cap, a confident young man in his first suit. I had curated these memories, polished them, kept them safe. I looked at the boy in the pictures and searched for the man from the restaurant. I couldn't find him. They were two different people, and I had clearly been a mother to the one who no longer existed. Memory is a treacherous accountant. It shows you the receipts of your sacrifices, but never warns you that the investment might be worthless. My mind, unbidden, took me back to the day I sold my parents' home. It wasn't just a house, it was the only place I had ever felt unconditionally safe. I remembered the scent of cedar and mothballs in the attic, the worn spot on the arm of my father's reading chair, the pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe that charted my growth from a small child to a gangly teenager. I stood in the empty foyer with the realtor, a kind woman with sad eyes, and my hand shook as I signed the papers. The proceeds didn't go into a safe index fund or a comfortable annuity. They went directly to a volatile, unproven startup called Aura Health. All for him, all for his dream. I sank onto the sofa, the plush velvet feeling cold against my skin. I remembered the nights, hunched over my laptop long after Mason had gone to bed, researching pharmaceutical regulations and market trends, subjects I knew nothing about, just so I could understand his world, just so I could help him proofread his funding proposals. I was more than an investor. I was his unpaid consultant, his tireless cheerleader, his strategic partner. We were a team, or so I had thought. The truth was, a team doesn't discard one of its players once the trophy is won. A son doesn't look at his mother and see a line item to be cut. A bitter coldness, deeper than any winter chill, began to seep into my bones. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a thoughtless mistake made in the dizzying excitement of a massive windfall. This was a decision, a calculated, rational, and utterly ruthless business decision. They had weighed my worth, my love, my sacrifice, my presence, and found it to be less than the cost of my rent. I sat there in the dark for hours, the city lights painting shifting patterns on the wall. I didn't cry. The pain was too sharp, too profound for tears. Tears are for sadness, for loss. This was an erasure. A quiet, polite, well-reasoned termination of my role in their lives. The role of mother, it seemed, was a contract position, and my term had just expired. As the first, pale hint of dawn began to soften the edges of the skyline, a new feeling began to crystallize within me, pushing past the shock and the grief. It was a cold, hard clarity. They had made their move based on a simple assumption that the woman who had given them everything would continue to do so, even if it meant giving up herself. They believed the mother who sacrificed would also be the mother who would quietly disappear. They thought they knew me. They knew the mother. They were about to meet Dr. Evelyn Reed. There is a certain clarity that follows absolute devastation. When the house of your life has burned to the ground, you are no longer distracted by the color of the curtains or the placement of the furniture. You see only the foundation and the sky. I woke on my sofa, the morning sun casting long, unforgiving stripes across the floor, and I saw the foundation of my new reality. It was cold, it was hard, and it was mine alone. Packing up a life is like performing an autopsy on a dream. You must be methodical, you must be detached. Emotion is a contaminant that clouds the process. I started in the kitchen, a place that had always been the warm, beating heart of our family. Now it was just a room with appliances. I wrapped the ceramic mugs, one by one, in newspaper. One of them, a gift from a mother's day long past, had "World's Best Mom" printed on it in a child's clumsy script. I wrapped it with the others, its cheerful declaration now a bitter irony, and placed it gently into a cardboard box. The living room was harder. The photographs on the mantel were not just images, they were artifacts of a love I had believed to be real. I took down the frame of Mason at his college graduation, his arm slung around my shoulder, both of us beaming. In that moment, I had felt my heart would burst with pride. Now, I saw the ghost of the man who would, just a few years later, declare me a cost-effective problem to be solved. I carefully wrapped the frame in bubble wrap and laid it to rest. I was not just packing away a picture, I was burying a memory. The task was immense, a quiet, monumental dismantling of a shared history. To do it, I needed more boxes. I remembered a stash in the small attic space above the hall closet, a dusty repository for the things you can't quite bring yourself to throw away. With a deep sigh, I pulled down the folding ladder and climbed into the dim, still air. The attic smelled of old paper and cedar, the scent of time itself. Cardboard boxes were stacked against one wall, labeled in my late husband Robert's neat architectural print: holiday decorations, Evelyn's research papers, winter clothes. My eyes landed on one I hadn't seen in years, tucked behind a set of old ski poles. It was a banker's box, and on the side, Robert had written simply, "Financial Personal." Robert. He had been the pragmatist, the one who balanced my sentimentality. "Love is essential, Ev," he used to say, tapping his pen on a stack of documents, "but a well-organized file is a close second." I smiled sadly. He would have been appalled by my handshake deal with Mason. He would have seen the danger I had been blind to. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. Perhaps I was just looking for a final piece of him to hold onto before I left. I pulled the heavy box out and sat on the dusty floor, prying open the lid. Inside was the mundane paper trail of a life lived together: old mortgage statements, tax returns from the 90s, car titles. Then I saw it. Near the bottom, beneath a folder of insurance policies, was a thick manila file. The tab read in Robert's handwriting, "Aura Health Initial Investment." My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't created this file. Robert had. He'd passed away less than a year after I'd given Mason the money, but he had clearly taken it upon himself to organize the paperwork. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. Inside, the first document was a copy of the wire transfer receipt for $950,000. Seeing the number in stark black and white was like a fresh stab to the heart. But there was another document behind it: heavier paper, denser text. It was several pages long, stapled neatly at the corner. It looked official, formal, a ghost from a past where trust was still the native language of our home. I tilted it toward the weak light filtering through the attic's single round window. At the top of the first page, in bold, capital letters, were words I had not thought about in 5 years: convertible promissory note. My mind, the mind of a research scientist trained to parse complex data, began to work, sifting through the legal jargon. I read the clauses slowly, my finger tracing the words. The principal sum of $950,000, payable to the holder, Dr. Evelyn Reed. At the sole option of the holder, all principal may be converted in whole into shares of the company's equity. Convertible. The word bloomed in my mind. Not a gift, not a donation. A loan that could be converted into ownership. A memory surfaced, hazy at first, then sharp and clear. It was in the lawyer's office Robert had insisted we visit. Mason had been impatient, tapping his foot, eager to get the check and start his new life. Robert had been calm, firm. "It's just a formality, son. A safety net. Your mother is giving you her entire future. This honors that." I remembered Mason signing the document with a quick, dismissive flourish. "Whatever you need, Mom," he'd said with a smile, his eyes on the prize, not on the paper. He likely never read it. He'd seen it as just another thing to appease his sentimental mother and pragmatic father. He had forgotten it instantly. But Robert hadn't, and he hadn't let me forget either. He had taken the signed document, filed it away, and in doing so had left me one final gift. One final act of protection from beyond the grave. I sat there in the dusty silence of the attic, holding the paper in my hands. It felt heavier than a simple document. It felt like a shield, like a key. The shaking in my body, the cold dread that had been my constant companion for 2 days, began to subside. It was replaced by a stillness, a deep, quiet, and formidable calm. The fog of grief and shock was beginning to burn away, and in its place, I could see a path forward. It was narrow, it was uncertain, and it was fraught with danger. But for the first time since I'd left that restaurant, it was there. I was no longer an old woman packing her life into boxes. I was a holder of a note, and I was about to call it due. I climbed down from the attic, the ladder groaning under my weight, and stepped back into the present. The folded document in my hand felt both as light as a whisper and as heavy as an anchor. In the dusty quiet of the attic, it had seemed like a miracle, a message from a past life. But here, in the bright, clinical light of my living room, it was simply a piece of paper, and I knew with a scientist's certainty that a single data point is not a conclusion. It is merely a question. My mind raced. I could read the words, equity, conversion, holder, and I understood their dictionary definitions. but I did not understand their power. I did not speak their language. To confront Mason and Olivia armed only with my own interpretation would be like walking into a gunfight with a textbook on ballistics. I would be eviscerated. They were right about one thing: I didn't understand business. Not their kind of business, anyway. The kind that reclassifies a mother as a liability. I needed a translator, a warrior. I needed someone who not only spoke the language of my enemies but had written the dictionaries it came from. I needed someone who operated on an older code, a code of honor that my husband, Robert, had lived by. And in that moment, only one name came to mind: David Chen. David and Robert had been more than colleagues, they had been intellectual sparring partners. Two sharp minds that found joy in dissecting the world's complexities over a game of chess and a bottle of scotch. David was a lion of corporate law, a man who could find the single, fatal flaw in a 100-page contract, the way a predator spots the weakest animal in a herd. He had semi-retired a few years ago, claiming he was tired of fighting with wolves in $1,000 suits. I hoped he had one more fight left in him. My hand was steady as I dialed his number from the landline in my study. The familiar baritone voice that answered after the second ring was a balm to my frayed nerves. David Chen. David, I said, my own voice sounding thin, fragile. It's Evelyn Reed. There was a pause, and then the warmth flooded the line. Evelyn, my goodness, how are you? I was so sorry to have missed Robert's memorial last year. I was, well, you know. I know, David, it's all right. I'm calling because I need your help. It's a legal matter. And a personal one. His tone shifted instantly, the pleasantries falling away, replaced by the focused calm I remembered so well. My door is always open for you, Evelyn. When can you be here? An hour later, I was sitting in a worn leather chair across from him in his home office. It was not a sleek, modern space like the ones Mason favored. It was a den of quiet power, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with law tomes, history, and philosophy. It smelled of old books and freshly brewed tea. David, with his shock of silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, listened without a single interruption as I told him everything. I recounted the dinner at the summit, the cold, clinical dismissal, the brochure for the facility in New Jersey. I spoke with the dispassionate precision of a scientist presenting a case study, keeping my voice even, my hands folded in my lap. But when I repeated Mason's words, unnecessary expense, I saw a muscle tighten in David's jaw. He had loved Robert, and in his world, you protected the people your friends loved. It was a simple, unbreakable rule. And you invested, he stated, more a confirmation than a question. Everything, I said softly. I slid the manila folder across the vast expanse of his mahogany desk. Robert kept a file. David opened it and began to read. He scanned the wire transfer receipt with a grim nod. Then he picked up the convertible note. The change in him was palpable. He was no longer just a friend listening sympathetically. He was the lion awakened. He put on a pair of reading glasses and leaned forward, his focus absolute. The only sound in the room was the soft rustle of the paper as he turned the page. He read it once, then he read it again. Finally, he took off his glasses and looked at me, and for the first time I saw a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. Evelyn, he said, his voice a low rumble, do you have any idea what this is? I think so, I said. It means the money was a loan, not a gift. David let out a short, sharp laugh. Oh, it's so much more than that. A simple loan they could pay back with interest and be done with you. This is a key. Robert didn't just give you a safety net. He gave you a sword. He picked up a pen and a legal pad. A convertible note, especially one this early in a company's life, is a dormant seat of power. Your son took your $1 million when Aura Health was nothing more than an idea on a napkin. Its valuation was, for legal purposes, practically zero. He started scribbling numbers. This note gives you the right to convert that entire principal, plus accrued interest, into common stock at the pre-money valuation, before the big institutional investors, before anyone. He looked up, his eyes gleaming. When you do that, you don't become a creditor they have to pay off. You become a part owner, a significant one. He circled a number on the pad and pushed it across the desk. I looked down. The number was so large it seemed fictional. Based on a standard conversion in a sale of this magnitude, David said, your initial investment of under $1 million doesn't just get paid back. It entitles you to an equity stake that is likely worth, at a conservative estimate, somewhere between 60 and $80 million. The air left my lungs. Your son and his fiancée didn't just lie to you, Evelyn. David continued, his voice now cold steel. They tried to defraud you. They tried to erase an $80 million partner from their cap table. The acquiring company, Gen Pharma, would have a catastrophic legal problem on their hands if they knew about this. The deal would be frozen, possibly even scuttled. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. He looked from the note to my face, and his expression softened. Robert was a brilliant man. He knew his son, and he knew who he married. He left this for you. A final checkmate. I finally allowed a single tear to trace a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of profound, aching gratitude for the man who was still taking care of me even now. What do we do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. David Chen smiled again, but this time there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a predator that had just caught the scent of its prey. What do we do? He repeated. First, you go home and you continue to pack your boxes just as they expect. You let them think they've won. He picked up his phone. And I, he said, punching in a number, am going to make a quiet little phone call. It's time we introduced ourselves to the lawyers at Gen Pharma. I left David Chen's office feeling like a different woman than the one who had entered. The grief was still there, a cold, heavy stone in my gut, but it was no longer the anchor of my despair. It was now the ballast in the keel of a ship that had just been given a new rudder and a map to a distant, dangerous shore. The city streets, which had seemed so hostile on my taxi ride home from the restaurant, now looked like a grid of possibilities, a chessboard waiting for the first move. David's final words to me echoed in my mind as I walked into my apartment. Go home, Evelyn, be the heartbroken mother, be the confused, elderly woman they have decided you are. They have drawn their own caricature of you, now you will simply inhabit it. Your weakness is their blind spot. Your silence is now an ambush. And so, I returned to the boxes. They were no longer symbols of my eviction, but props in a meticulously staged play. I resumed packing, but with a new purpose. Each dish wrapped in paper, each book placed in a box, was an act of camouflage. While my hands performed the quiet, mournful tasks of a woman dismantling her life, my mind was a silent war room, replaying David's strategy, anticipating the enemy's response. I thought of Mason. I thought of the countless nights I had sat with him, a small boy struggling with a fever, my hand on his forehead, whispering that everything would be all right. It is a profound and disorienting thing to realize that the person you would have died for is the same person who has engineered your living death. The betrayal was not a single event. It was the revelation that the entire foundation of my life had been built on sand. As I worked, David worked. I did not need to see him to know what he was doing. I could picture him in his study, not with a phone, but with a pen. He would not be firing off an angry email. He would be crafting a weapon, a letter. It would be printed on heavy, cream-colored bond paper, the kind that feels important before you even read the words. It would be addressed not to Mason, but to the senior partner of the prestigious law firm, one of those names like Skadden or Cravath that drips with power, representing Gen Pharma in the acquisition. The letter, as David had described it, would be a masterpiece of understated threat. It would be polite, formal, and utterly chilling in its implications. It would not mention my name. It would not mention betrayal or family drama. It would simply state, to whom it may concern, please be advised that our firm represents a founding investor and primary note holder in the entity known as Aura Health, LLC. Pursuant to the rights outlined in a convertible promissory note executed on date, our client holds significant and as yet unconverted equity. We hereby formally request a full cessation of the due diligence process, pending our review of all financial statements, capitalization tables, and the terms of the proposed acquisition by your client, Gen Pharma. We trust you will treat this matter with the urgency it deserves. It was a single, perfectly aimed stone, and its target was the placid, multi-billion-dollar lake of their deal. The ripple would be immediate and devastating. In the world of high-stakes acquisitions, an unknown variable is a virus. The appearance of an unlisted, primary investor is not a minor hiccup. It is a potential legal catastrophe. David's letter would have landed on that partner's desk and triggered an immediate, frantic chain of events. Phone calls would be made, alarms would be raised. A $200 million deal would grind to a screeching halt, all because of a single anonymous founding investor. For 2 days, I heard nothing. I played my part with an actor's discipline. I continued to pack. I sorted through closets, creating piles for donation and for storage. I even answered a brief, cheerful text from Olivia, who sent me a link to the website for Maple Grove Senior Community, the place they had chosen for my exile. "Doesn't this look cozy, Evelyn? They have a book club." I replied with a simple, "Thank you for thinking of me, dear." The banality of it all was nauseating, but I knew my compliance was essential. They had to believe I was defeated. The silence broke on the third day, late in the afternoon. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The caller ID read, Mason. I let it ring 3 times before answering, taking a deep breath to steady my voice to summon the ghost of the fragile woman I was pretending to be. "Hello?" I answered, my voice deliberately soft and a little tired. "Mom." His voice was tight, stretched thin like a wire about to snap. He was trying to sound casual, but a frantic energy hummed just beneath the surface. "Hey, just checking in. How's the packing?" "Oh, it's coming along, dear," I sighed, injecting a note of weary sadness. "It's a bigger job than I thought. So many memories in this old place." Right, he said quickly, impatiently. "Listen, a weird question. Have you spoken to anyone lately? About, business things, the old investment?" I could feel my heart beating a steady, powerful rhythm. The ripple had reached the shore. I feigned confusion. "Business things? Mason, who would I talk to about that? It's all in your hands now. You know I don't understand any of it." There was a pause on his end, pregnant with suspicion and frustration. He suspected me, but my performance was too perfect, too aligned with the caricature he had created. How could his frail, clueless mother orchestrate a sophisticated legal intervention? The idea was absurd to him. "No, of course not," he finally said, the strain in his voice palpable. The lawyers are asking some strange questions. Some mix-up, I'm sure. Don't worry about it." "Oh, I won't, dear," I said, looking at the box on the floor labeled Financial Personal. "I have complete faith in you to handle everything." He hung up a few moments later, his parting words clipped and distracted. I placed the phone back on the counter, my hand perfectly still. The first shot had been fired, not with a cannon's roar, but with the quiet, deadly precision of a sniper. And it had hit its mark. The panic was beginning. And I knew with every fiber of my being that this was only the beginning. After Mason's call ended, I did not allow myself the luxury of triumph. Triumph is a hot, blinding emotion, and what this new reality required was a cold, clear focus. He knew, or rather he suspected. The gears were turning in his mind, but his arrogance would prevent him from seeing the truth. He would see a slighted mother's petty revenge, not a calculated legal gambit. And in that underestimation, I would find my strength. I knew they would come. The phone call was just the reconnaissance. The full assault was imminent, so I prepared. I did not barricade the doors or call David for reassurance. I went into the kitchen and put the kettle on to boil. I took out my best porcelain teapot, the one Robert had given me on our 25th anniversary, and selected a calming chamomile blend. I was preparing for a confrontation, but I would greet it with the unassailable placidity of a woman offering afternoon tea. They arrived less than an hour later. The doorbell rang not with a polite chime, but with a hard, impatient press. I looked through the peephole and saw them, a portrait of unraveling ambition. Mason's tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, a stark contrast to the polished executive at the summit. Olivia stood beside him, her posture rigid, her lipstick a slash of defiant red in a face pale with anxiety. I opened the door and offered them the same gentle, slightly sad smile I had been perfecting. "Mason, Olivia, what a surprise." They stormed past me, foregoing any pretense of courtesy. Cut the act, Mom, Mason snapped, turning to face me in the foyer. His eyes were wild with a mixture of anger and fear. What did you do? I feigned a gentle confusion, clutching the collar of my robe. Do? I've been packing, dear. It's been very difficult, but I'm making progress. Don't play dumb with us, Olivia spat, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The Gen Pharma deal is on hold, indefinitely. The lawyers are in a panic about some undisclosed founding investor. Sound familiar, Evelyn? I met her glare with a look of wide-eyed innocence. I don't understand. What does that have to do with me? I walked past them toward the living room. I've just made some tea. Why don't you come and sit down? My calmness was gasoline on the fire of their panic. They followed me, their movements jerky and aggressive. This is because of the restaurant, isn't it? Olivia accused, her voice rising. This is some pathetic, vindictive little game because you were upset about the seating. Do you have any idea what you're doing? You are jeopardizing a $200 million acquisition because your feelings were hurt. I poured the hot water into the teapot, my hands perfectly steady. I was hurt, Olivia. That's true. But this isn't about my feelings. It's about clarifying the facts of my investment. Mason threw his hands up in exasperation. Investment, Mom. For the last time, it was a gift. And now you've hired some shark to blow everything up. You have to call them off now. You don't understand the kind of trouble you're causing. Actually, I think I'm just beginning to understand, I said, placing the teapot on a tray with 3 cups. I looked at him, my expression one of gentle sorrow. I'm an old woman, Mason. I don't have much to my name anymore except that initial contribution. With everything changing, I just wanted to be sure it was properly accounted for. I thought that was the responsible thing to do. Every word was a carefully chosen note in a symphony of feigned helplessness, and it was driving them mad. They had built their entire plan on the premise of my weakness, my ignorance. My refusal to conform to that role was a flaw in their calculations they simply could not comprehend. Mason paced the room like a caged animal. Properly accounted for, you've thrown a grenade into the most important moment of my life. The buyers are spooked. Our lawyers are demanding to know who this person is. They're threatening to walk away. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding that can be easily cleared up, I said soothingly, offering him a cup. He ignored it. It was then that he made his fatal mistake. His frustration boiled over, shattering his carefully constructed facade of the concerned son. This is unbelievable, he roared, his face contorted with rage. I can't believe you're doing this over some meaningless piece of paper Robert made you sign to make you feel important. It was a formality, Mom. It meant nothing then, and it means nothing now. The room fell silent. Even Olivia seemed taken aback by his outburst. He had said it. He had admitted, in front of a witness, that he knew about the document, that he remembered it, and that he had consciously chosen to ignore it, dismissing it, and by extension, his father's wisdom and my contribution, as meaningless. I did not react. I simply absorbed the information, my mind filing it away with cold, clean precision. I looked at him, the son I had raised, and saw him clearly for the first time. The charming ambition was a mask for a desperate, entitled greed. The love I thought he had for me was merely an appreciation for my utility. Now that my utility had changed, so had his affection. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The chamomile was warm and soothing. A meaningless piece of paper, I repeated softly, my voice devoid of emotion. Is that what your father's foresight was to you, Mason? Is that what my life savings were? He had the decency to look away, a flicker of shame in his eyes before the anger returned. You just don't get it, he muttered, shaking his head. Oh, I believe I do, I said. I believe I finally do. They left soon after that. Their assault had failed. Their threats had bounced off my wall of quiet reason, and their anger had only served to expose their own desperation. They stormed out of the apartment, leaving the scent of their panic and expensive cologne lingering in the air. I stood in the silence, looking at the 2 untouched cups of tea on the coffee table. The battle was far from over, but the nature of the war had changed. I was no longer the territory being fought over. I was a sovereign nation, with a standing army and a clear strategic objective. Their unraveling was no longer my sorrow, it was my advantage. After they left, the apartment felt cavernous, the silence they left behind ringing with the echoes of their fury. I walked to the living room and picked up the two teacups, still full, that sat on the coffee table like abandoned chess pieces after a forfeited match. As I poured the untouched tea down the drain, I felt a peculiar sense of calm. The confrontation had not shaken me, it had confirmed everything. Their panic was the most honest thing they had offered me in years. I immediately called David. I recounted the conversation, making sure to quote Mason's outburst verbatim. "A meaningless piece of paper Robert made you sign to make you feel important," I repeated, my voice flat and clinical. There was a moment of silence on David's end, and then I heard a low, grim chuckle. "He said that in front of his fiancée?" "He did." "The fool," David said with a tone of deep professional satisfaction. "The arrogant, short-sighted fool. He just handed us a gift, Evelyn." He admitted his knowledge of the document and his intent to disregard it, with a witness present. "This is no longer just about what the paper says, it's about his willful decision to break the agreement." David promised to use this new development and instructed me to continue my performance. The next 2 days were a masterclass in quiet deception. I communicated with the moving company I'd hired, discussing packing logistics. I even took a call from a cheerful representative at Maple Grove Senior Community, asking thoughtful questions about their meal plans and social activities. I was building my cover, brick by brick, ensuring that any surveillance from my children would only confirm their narrative, a defeated woman preparing for her exile. The real work, however, was happening in the quiet hum of David Chen's law firm. As he had predicted, the grenade he'd thrown had caused chaos. The legal team at Gen Pharma, faced with a nine-figure deal being held up by a mysterious and potentially massive claim, had been forced to grant David limited, supervised access to Aura Health's early-stage financial records. They needed to know the nature of the threat. The call from David came on a Thursday morning. His voice was different. The lawyer's satisfaction was gone, replaced by something harder, colder. "Evelyn, are you sitting down?" "I am," I said, sinking onto the edge of a packing box. "I've been through the initial capitalization documents," he said, his voice tight. "The ones Mason filed with his first board of directors 5 years ago." He paused. "He didn't just ignore your note, Evelyn, he actively erased you." I felt a familiar chill creep up my spine. "What do you mean?" "In the section for initial capital contributions, he lists his own funds, $50,000. Then, in a separate schedule for non-equity gifts and familial loans, he lists an anonymous familial gift of $950,000. He structured it to look like a generous donation from a family member, with no equity attachment, no conversion rights. Nothing. He didn't just sideline you, he wrote you out of the official history of the company you founded." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. This was not a sin of omission, it was a sin of commission. He had deliberately, and with legal paperwork, misrepresented my investment. He had reduced my sacrifice to a footnote, a ghost in the financial machine of his success. "This changes everything." David's voice was sharp, pulling me from my shock. "This isn't just a son breaking a promise to his mother. This is a founder potentially committing financial fraud against a primary investor. He misrepresented the company's capital structure to his board and, by extension, to his buyers. This is serious." He then asked the question that would change the course of the day. "Evelyn, think back. Did he ever, in writing, in an email or a text, refer to your money as an investment? Did he ever mention a share or a stake?" My mind, which had felt clouded with grief, suddenly sharpened. There was a difference between a feeling and a fact, and I needed facts. I don't know, David, it was so long ago." "Look," he urged, his voice firm but kind. "I can build a case on the note alone, but if we can prove his intent in his own words, we can leave him with no room to maneuver. Search your records." After we hung up, I walked into my study. In the corner, covered by a dust sheet, was my old desktop computer. I hadn't used it in years, but I'd never had the heart to get rid of it. It was a digital attic, a repository of a decade of my life. I powered it on, and the machine whirred to life with a low, groaning hum. For the next hour, I journeyed back in time, scrolling through thousands of old emails. I saw the digital history of my relationship with Mason, proud announcements of his college grades, links to articles he thought I'd find interesting, photos of his first apartment. It was a painful, archaeological dig into a civilization now in ruins. I searched for keywords investment or a health, agreement, stake. The results were a blur of irrelevant messages. My hope began to fade. Perhaps he had always been careful, always referred to it verbally. And then I saw it an email thread from nearly 5 years ago. The subject line was simple seed funding agreement. My heart hammered against my ribs. I clicked it open. The thread contained a brief back and forth about the logistics of the wire transfer. And at the bottom, the final message was from Mason. I read the words and the world fell away. Mom, he had written, his tone youthful and full of genuine excitement. I'm heading to the lawyer's office now to sign the note. Thank you again for being my first and most important investor. I know it's a huge risk, but I promise I will make you proud. Just think when we sell this thing one day, your 15% founding stake will be worth a fortune. Couldn't do this without you. Love, M. 15%. He had written it himself. He understood the terms. He acknowledged my stake. He had lied. My breath came out in a ragged gasp. I took a screenshot, saved the email as a PDF, and attached it to a new message. My fingers flew across the keyboard. To David Chen, subject the ghost. I've attached an email from Mason dated 5 years ago. I believe you will find it illuminating. Best, Evelyn. I hit send. As I watched the email disappear into the digital ether, I looked out the window. The fight was no longer about money. It was no longer about a broken promise. It was about the truth. He had not only tried to steal my future, he had tried to rewrite my past. And I now held the original manuscript. The email containing Mason's signed confession was a digital time bomb, and the moment I hit send, I could almost hear the silent, frantic ticking begin. David's call came less than 10 minutes later. There was a new energy in his voice, the thrill of a seasoned hunter who knows the prey is cornered. Evelyn, this is it, he said, his voice sharp and alive. This isn't a smoking gun. This is a signed confession delivered with a gift ribbon. He used the words investor and stake in the same sentence. There is no ambiguity. There is no room for interpretation. What does it mean for us now? I asked, my own voice steady. It means we are no longer on the defensive. It means we stop asking and start dictating. I'm going to go silent on my end. I won't respond to the frantic calls I'm now getting from Gen Pharma's counsel. We're going to let them stew in the uncertainty. We're going to let the pressure cook. He paused, his tone becoming instructive. And that pressure, Evelyn, is going to flow downhill directly to Mason. He will become desperate, and when he is desperate, he will come to you with an offer. He will try to buy his way out of this problem. And what do? You listen, David said, his voice firm. You do not accept, you do not refuse, you do not show them this new card you're holding. You simply listen to their offer, and you continue to be the confused, overwhelmed mother who doesn't know what to do. Let them believe they are still negotiating with a woman. They have no idea they are now negotiating with a law firm. For the next 48 hours, I lived inside a strange, suspended reality. The silence from Mason and Olivia was deafening. It was not the silence of neglect, but the tense, humming silence of a server farm processing a catastrophic error. I could feel their frantic energy from across the city. I imagined the panicked phone calls, the emergency meetings with lawyers, the accusations hurled back and forth in the pristine, minimalist apartment they had built on a foundation of my life savings. Meanwhile, I continued my theater of defeat. I labeled boxes. I made a detailed inventory of my furniture. I was a model of compliance, a woman preparing for the next, diminished chapter of her life. But with every book I packed, I felt a growing sense of power. They thought they were seeing a surrender. I knew they were witnessing a strategic redeployment. They had sought to reduce me to a simple number on a balance sheet. They had no idea that my value was not in the past, but in the future, a future they could no longer control. They arrived on Saturday morning. They didn't call first. The unannounced visit was a power play, an attempt to catch me off guard. They stood at my door, a carefully reconstructed portrait of contrition. Mason was holding a large box from my favorite bakery, the one he used to bring me on Sunday mornings as a boy. Olivia clutched a bouquet of white lilies, funereal in their stark purity. Mom, Mason began, his voice low and earnest as I let them in. Can we talk? I led them to the living room, a landscape of half-packed boxes. They sat on the sofa, a comical island of designer clothing amidst the cardboard chaos. We've been doing a lot of thinking, Mason started, placing the pastry box on the coffee table. And we were wrong, terribly wrong. The way we handled things at the restaurant was inexcusable. It was the stress of the deal, the pressure, it's not who we are. Olivia nodded, her eyes wide with practiced sincerity. We were awful, Evelyn. We never meant to devalue your incredible generosity. We were just so focused on the business side of things, we lost perspective. We lost sight of what's truly important, family. I listened, my expression one of weary sadness. I was a spectator at my own intervention. We want to make it right. Mason leaned forward, his hands clasped together. We've spoken to our financial advisors. We want to show you how much we appreciate everything you've done. Here it was, the offer. Olivia took over, her voice smooth as silk. We would like to offer you a settlement, Evelyn, to ensure you are taken care of for the rest of your life in the style you deserve. We will provide you with $2 million tax-free. She let the number hang in the air. $2 million, a fortune to most, a pittance compared to what was mine. And, she continued, pressing her advantage, we will, of course, purchase a lovely condominium for you. Upper East Side, if you like. Whatever you want, a new start. She smiled a benevolent, queenly smile. All we ask is that you sign a simple release acknowledging that the initial funds were a gift, and instruct your lawyer to stand down. We can put this all behind us. The word gift was the poison in the honeyed drink. They weren't making it right. They were trying to buy my signature on their lie. I let the silence stretch, widening my eyes as if overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the number. I looked from Mason's hopeful face to Olivia's expectant one. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly. 2 million? I whispered as if I could barely comprehend it. Oh my, that's so much money. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Mom, Mason urged, his relief almost palpable. He saw my hesitation not as strategy, but as the predictable confusion of an old woman dazzled by a large number. It's a wonderful offer. It solves everything. It lets our family heal. I looked down at my hands, feigning a deep internal conflict. I needed to give them an answer that was not an answer at all. You were both so angry just the other day, I said, my voice wavering. And now this, it's all so much to take in. You must understand. This was never about money. It was about, well, it's complicated. I looked up, my eyes misty. I'm just so tired of fighting. I'm just an old woman, Mason. I need to think. I need a little time to process what's best for everyone. Their faces fell. They had expected an immediate, grateful acceptance. My indecisiveness was an obstacle. The lawyers need to move fast, Mom, Mason said, a hint of the old impatience creeping back into his voice. This offer is only on the table for a short time. I understand, dear, I said, mustering my most pathetic, apologetic smile. I promise I will think very hard. I just need a day, please. They left with a sense of frustrated optimism. They had not secured my surrender, but they believed it was imminent. They saw a weak, emotional woman on the verge of capitulating. They were blind to the trap they had just so eagerly walked into. The moment the door clicked shut, the fragility vanished from my posture. I stood up, walked to my study, and dialed David's number. David, it's Evelyn. I could hear the smile in his voice. Let me guess, they came bearing gifts and a checkbook. 2 million, I said, and a condo. There was a short pause. Then David's voice came back, laced with the grim satisfaction of a grandmaster cornering a king. Perfect, he said. They just put a price tag on their fraud. They've admitted, with a 7-figure offer, precisely what your silence is worth to them. He took a breath. They've shown their hand, Evelyn. Now we show them ours. The day of the meeting was cold and clear, the autumn sky a hard, brilliant blue. It was the kind of day that made the glass and steel towers of Midtown Manhattan look like jagged crystals reaching for a distant sun. I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, not with the trepidation of a woman heading to her doom, but with the solemn focus of a general preparing for a decisive battle. The woman who stared back at me was not the one they had tried to exile. I had left the sad, floral dresses in the closet, In their place, I wore a charcoal gray suit of impeccably tailored wool that I hadn't worn in years. My silver hair was not in its usual soft bun, but styled in a sleek, elegant cut that framed my face. I wore no jewelry save for my simple wedding band and a pair of pearl earrings. I looked like who I was, Dr. Evelyn Reed. I was not dressing to impress them. I was dressing to remind myself of the woman they had forced me to become. The meeting was not held at David's comfortable, book-lined office, nor at the sterile, soulless firm representing Mason. David had insisted on neutral territory, a place of immense power where my son's charm and Olivia's theatrics would be rendered useless. We met in a glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of the skyscraper that housed the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, the legal titans representing Gen Pharma. I walked in with David at my side. Mason and Olivia were already there, seated at the far end of a monstrously long, polished mahogany table. They looked confident, relaxed, like a royal couple holding court. They believed they had been summoned to negotiate the final terms of my surrender. When they saw me, their smiles faltered. I saw a flicker of confusion in Mason's eyes, a tightening in Olivia's jaw. I was not the woman they had made their $2 million offer to. I simply met their gaze, gave a cool, slight nod, and took a seat opposite them, placing my leather portfolio on the table before me. The room was filled with men in dark suits, lawyers and executives from Gen Pharma, their faces impassive, their impatience a palpable force in the room. They saw this as a minor, irritating family squabble holding up a nine-figure deal. A senior partner, a man with a mane of white hair and a weary expression, cleared his throat. "Mr. Chen," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "We are all very busy people. We trust we can resolve this delicate matter quickly. Your client has been made a very generous offer." David smiled, a thin, wintry smile. "My client has no interest in your client's offer," he said, his voice cutting through the room's tense atmosphere. "We are not here to negotiate, we are here to inform." He stood and walked to the head of the table. "For the record, I am David Chen, representing Dr. Evelyn Reed, a founding investor in Aura Health." He gestured toward me. The title Dr. Evelyn Reed, founding investor, hung in the air, fundamentally reframing my presence. I was not Mason's mother. I was a principal in this transaction. "As you know," David continued, "your acquisition of Aura Health was halted due to a claim on founding equity. My client's son, Mr. Mason Reed, has attempted to characterize her initial seed funding of $950,000 as a familial gift." Mason shifted in his chair, a dark flush creeping up his neck. "However," David said, his voice dangerously soft, "we have documentation that proves otherwise." He opened a portfolio and retrieved a document, placing a copy before each person at the table. Exhibit A, a fully executed convertible promissory note, signed by Mr. Reed, guaranteeing the holder the right to convert the principal and interest into common stock. A murmur went through the Gen Pharma side of the table. Their lawyers began reading the document, their expressions shifting from boredom to sharp, focused alarm. Olivia whispered something to Mason, who shook his head, his face pale. "Mr. Reed has recently claimed, in a moment of candor, that he considered this document a meaningless piece of paper," David said, his eyes locking onto Mason. "A mere formality to appease his parents. A rather cavalier attitude to take with a legally binding contract." He then turned to the large screen on the wall. "Fortunately, Mr. Reed's memory of the agreement seems to have been clearer 5 years ago. Exhibit B." He clicked a button, and the image of Mason's email filled the screen. The words were massive, undeniable, projected in stark black and white for the entire room to see. "Thank you again for being my first and most important investor. Just think, when we sell this thing one day, your 15% founding stake will be worth a fortune." A collective, sharp intake of breath seemed to be sucked from the room. I watched the color drain completely from Mason's face. He looked as if he had been physically struck. Olivia stared at the screen, her mouth slightly agape, the mask of composure utterly shattered. She was not looking at Mason with support, but with the cold, hard appraisal of a woman realizing her asset has just been devalued to zero. David let the image hang in the silence for a long moment before speaking again. 15%, he said quietly. Not a gift, not a loan, a founding stake. He clicked again, and the screen now showed a side-by-side comparison. Mason's email on the left, and on the right, the official financial schedule he had filed, listing my contribution as an anonymous, non-equity gift. Which brings us to Exhibit C, David said, his voice like ice. Willful financial misrepresentation. Fraud. The word landed in the center of the mahogany table like a block of granite. The Gen Pharma lawyers were no longer looking at David. They were all looking at me. The balance of power in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. David delivered the final, devastating blow. As per the terms of this note, and as confirmed by Mr. Reed's own correspondence, Dr. Reed is exercising her right of conversion. Her 15% stake in Aura Health, based on your own $200 million valuation, is worth $30 million. The number, so stark and clean, seemed to silence all thought. $30 million. This deal, David concluded, turning to the white-haired partner, does not proceed. Not a single paper is signed, not a single dollar is transferred without Dr. Reed's explicit approval. And as of this moment, my client is undecided as to whether she wishes to approve a sale that was predicated on a lie. He sat down. The coup was complete. All eyes were on me. Mason stared at me, his face a mask of utter horror and disbelief. He was not looking at an investor or a legal opponent. He was looking at his mother and seeing, for the very first time, the woman he had created. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply met my son's gaze from across the vast, polished table and held it. The silence was my answer. The silence was my victory. The silence that followed David's final declaration was not empty. It was dense, heavy, and filled with the wreckage of my son's life. The white-haired partner from Gen Pharma was the first to move. He stood, his chair scraping back with a sound of harsh finality, and looked not at Mason, but at David and me. Mr. Chen Dr. Reed, he said, his voice a low, clinical monotone. It appears a significant restructuring of this deal is in order. My team will be in touch with yours to discuss the new terms. This meeting is adjourned. He and his colleagues filed out of the room without a single glance toward Mason or Olivia. They were no longer relevant. They were simply part of the collateral damage, a problem to be cleaned up by lawyers. David gathered his papers with quiet efficiency, gave my shoulder a brief, firm squeeze, and followed them out, leaving the three of us alone in the cavernous, glass-walled room. We were suspended 40 floors above the city, but it felt as though we were at the bottom of the ocean. The pressure was immense. Olivia was the first to break. She stood up, her movements stiff and unnatural. She looked at Mason, her face a mask of cold fury. There was no sympathy there, no partnership. I was watching a hyena assess a wounded lion and decide he was no longer worth the effort. You told me it was handled, she said, her voice a venomous whisper. You told me she was a sentimental old fool. You told me the paper meant nothing. Mason started, his voice a hoarse croak. I didn't know. No, she cut him off, grabbing her ridiculously expensive handbag from the table. You didn't think. You were arrogant and stupid, and you cost me everything. She turned and walked towards the door, her heels clicking an angry staccato on the marble floor. She didn't look back. The door swung shut behind her, leaving a profound and final silence in its wake. Now it was just the two of us, mother and son, or perhaps what was left of them. Mason finally looked at me, his eyes pleading, desperate. He was searching for the mother he had discarded, the one who fixed everything, the one who always forgave, but she was not in the room. Mom, he whispered, the words sounding foreign, a relic from another language. I stood up. There is nothing left to say, Mason. I walked out of the boardroom and did not look back. The days that followed were a blur of legal activity, a storm I observed from the quiet calm of my apartment. David handled everything. The deal was, as the Gen Pharma partner had said, restructured. To salvage the acquisition, Mason was forced to sign over the vast majority of his founder's equity to me. the amount stipulated by the convertible note and his own incriminating email. He would walk away from the company he had built on my back with a sum that was, by any normal standard, significant. But compared to the fortune he had grasped for, it was dust. More than the money, he lost his reputation. The story of his fraud, though never made public, would ripple through the tight-knit world of finance and tech. The golden boy's sheen was gone forever. He came to me one last time, a week later. It was raining, a miserable gray drizzle that matched the state of his world. He stood at my door, not with pastries or flowers, but with empty hands and a hollowed-out look in his eyes. He was soaked, his expensive coat clinging to his frame, making him look smaller, younger, and utterly defeated. I let him in. He stood dripping on my entryway rug, a lost boy who had finally found his way home, only to discover it was no longer his. "She's gone," he said, his voice flat. "Olivia." She packed her bags the next day, said she hadn't signed on for a rebuilding year. She took the car. I said nothing, I just waited. "They're all gone," he continued, a tremor in his voice. "The investors, the partners. No one will take my calls. I'm a pariah." He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, self-pitying grief. "You did this, you ruined me." "No, Mason," I said, and my voice was not angry. It was just tired, the voice of a truth that had been silenced for too long. "I didn't do this. You did. You did this the moment you decided my love was a line item you could afford to cut." "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words tearing from him in a raw, ugly sob. "Mom, I am so sorry. I never meant for it to go so far. I was drowning in debt, the pressure, Olivia." She just kept pushing, saying you'd never miss the money, that you wouldn't even know how to manage it. He was offering me excuses, not an apology. He was still trying to spread the blame, to paint himself as a victim of circumstance. "You are asking me to forgive you," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "But you don't seem to understand what it is you have done. This was never about the $30 million, Mason. It was about the dinner. It was about the cold, practical way you and your fiancé informed me that my presence in your life was no longer cost-effective. It was about you looking at the woman who sold her parents' home for you and seeing nothing more than an expense." He flinched, the truth of it hitting him. "What can I do?" he pleaded. "Tell me how to fix this. I'll do anything." I looked at my son, at the wreck of a man he had become, and I felt a deep, profound wave of sorrow. But not pity. Pity was a luxury I could no longer afford. "You're asking how to fix something," I said, my voice softening into its final, irrevocable judgment. "But some things, once they are shattered, cannot be fixed. They can only be understood. For years, I showed you who I was, your mother, your partner, your believer. And at that dinner, you finally showed me who you are." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle between us. "And my only choice now, the only thing left for me to do, is to believe you." He stared at me, understanding dawning in his tear-filled eyes. There would be no redemption. There would be no maternal embrace that made it all okay. He had made his choice, and I had made mine. He had traded his mother for a fortune, and in the end he was left with neither. I walked him to the door. He did not resist. The fight had gone out of him. As he stepped out into the rain, he turned back one last time. "I loved you, Mom," he whispered. "I know," I said, and it was the saddest truth I had ever spoken. "That's what makes it unforgivable." I closed the door, and as the lock clicked into place, I knew I was not just shutting him out. I was shutting the door on the woman I had been, the one who would have, in the end, forgiven him, and I did not mourn her passing. The door did not reopen. In the months that followed, there were no more calls, no more letters, no more desperate apologies. The silence that fell between me and my son was absolute, a vast, unbridgeable chasm. I did not mourn the loss of the man he had become, but I will admit there were quiet moments late at night when I mourned the memory of the little boy who once thought I was the sun and the moon. Grief, I learned, is not a single event, but a long, quiet conversation with the ghosts of what might have been. I did not move out of the apartment. I unpacked the boxes. In a symbolic act of reclaiming my own life, I redecorated. I painted the walls a warm, inviting cream. I replaced the cold, minimalist furniture they had favored with pieces that were comfortable and timeless. And I took down the gallery of Mason's achievements, replacing them with art that I loved, with photographs of my late husband, and with images of the places in the world I now plan to see. The space transformed from a monument to a broken, passed into a sanctuary for a future I was building myself. The money, a staggering sum that felt more like a theoretical concept than a reality, sat in a trust managed by David. It could have been a burden, a constant, glittering reminder of the pain that brought it to me. But I refused to let it be. My life had been defined by one disastrous investment. I decided my future would be defined by better ones. 6 months after the boardroom coup, I found myself once again ascending in the glass elevator, rising 60 floors above the glittering expanse of Manhattan. I was returning to the summit. The hostess, a young woman with a warm smile, led me to a prime table by the window. The same table. I had requested it specifically. I needed to sit in the exact spot where my world had been shattered, not to relive the pain, but to overwrite the memory. The city spread out before me, the same galaxy of lights, but I saw it differently now. It was no longer a cold, indifferent universe of other people's dreams. It was a landscape of human endeavor, of hope and struggle, a place where new ideas were being born every minute. I was not there to meet a son or a fiancé. I was there to meet a future. Her name was Dr. Eris Thorne. She was a brilliant, fiercely intelligent young biochemist in her early 30s, with eyes that burned with a passion for her work and a threadbare blazer that suggested she spent more on her lab equipment than on her wardrobe. She was nervous, clutching a worn leather portfolio to her chest. She was seeking funding for her startup, a revolutionary new technology for early-stage cancer detection. She had been turned down by every major venture capital firm. Her idea was too novel, the timeline too long, the profit margin not immediate enough. She reminded me of myself, years ago, a young researcher with a passion that the world was not yet ready for. She spoke for an hour, her initial nervousness melting away as she explained the science, her hands sketching complex molecular structures on a napkin. She spoke of saving lives, not of market share. She spoke of her team, not of her ego. She spoke of a dream, and it was a dream I recognized. When she finished, she looked at me, her expression vulnerable, expecting another polite rejection. I simply smiled. "Dr. Thorne," I said, my voice clear and steady. "The Reed Foundation was created for precisely this reason. We would be honored to provide the seed funding to make your vision a reality." The look on her face, the sudden, dawning shock, the welling of tears of pure, unadulterated joy, was a return on investment greater than any number a bank could ever show me. In her, I was not just funding a company. I was investing in the kind of world I wanted to live in. I was taking the pain of my son's ethical void and using it to fill the funding gap for someone whose ethics were the very core of her being. This, I realized, was the true meaning of wealth. It is not a summit you reach, but a seed you plant. After she left, floating on a cloud of disbelief and gratitude, I remained at the table for a while, alone with my thoughts and the glittering city. The memory of that terrible dinner was still here, but it was no longer a gaping wound. It was a scar, a part of my history that proved I had survived something that was meant to destroy me. I had lost a son, but I had found myself. And in the process, I had learned that the most valuable thing a person can possess is not a fortune, but a purpose. I raised my water glass to the city, to the future, and to the resilient, unbreakable strength that can be forged only in the fires of profound loss. I was no longer a ghost at this banquet. I was the host of my own. Thank you for listening and sharing this journey with me. Life is filled with unexpected trials, but it is in how we face them that we discover our true strength. May you and your families be blessed with health, happiness, and the unbreakable bonds of true love and respect.